Ladies and gentlemen.
Hey everyone, welcome back to our podcast, A Lion Among the Sheep. Coach Scott here with you today, and as promised a couple of weeks ago, I have with me today, it's an honor and joy, no pun intended, Oil of Joy is her book, but it's Christine de Costa, who is the author of a wonderful read called Oil of Joy. And I talked about this, actually I talked about it when we talked about vulnerability, I believe, on our podcast on vulnerability. Christine, welcome to the podcast. It is a joy to have you here and a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Scott.
So, tell me, listen, let's start. I mean, I've met you through friends and you have an amazing story just from reading this book. And I would like, just tell me about yourself. Tell me just like we never met each other. I'm going to ask Christine,
Okay.
Tell me about yourself. Tell our viewers about Christine de Costa. A little background.
Okay. So originally I'm from New York. I have two siblings, one older, one younger. I would say that at about the age of 3 or 4, I started to notice that something about me was very different from my sister. My sister had friends and she liked them and she always liked them. And for me, I liked some of my friends today and I didn't like them so much tomorrow. And my sister used to make fun of me and tell me that, you have to choose a side, basically. Well, as we got older and I guess my change in mood, which would happen pretty often, my sister picked up on before my parents did. And so my sister went to my parents and told my parents, you guys should talk to Christine. She seems a little like different. She seems very emotional.
If I can ask, let me take a step back. As
Sure.
I told you in the first podcast, Christine battled with and overcame bipolar disorder. So when we were talking about your sisters, what was your age when you started noticing that you were not like your sister and you had, differences were there and she went to your parents to talk to Christine. What age did that start coming about?
Honestly, that was about when I was 4 years old.
Okay.
We started noticing that things were a little different. By time my sister was between 8 and 10, that's when she started taking it to my family and talking to them. And at that time I was about 5. Okay. So 5 or 6. But I didn't get diagnosed actually until I was 27.
Right.
So it was a long road in between all of that time. Right. And throughout all of that time, there were a lot of mistakes made and there were a lot of errors, I guess.
Right. Well, let's go back. So at 5 years old, your sister, who was 8, I believe, goes to your parents, Hey, Christine you have to talk to Christine. She's different, whatever the terminology was. What were you doing? You said you liked somebody one day, the next day you didn't like it. It was hot and cold. It was
very much so.
It was just like you're all in or all out, basically.
100%. The reactions that I would give is you could tell me today that we're going to eat steak and it was great and fine and beautiful. And tomorrow you could tell me we're going to have steak and there would be a whole show for them.
Okay. Temper tantrums.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely not willing to do it, not wanting to do it, not liking steak that day, whatever it was.
And your parents just, chalk this up to a child being a kid.
Yeah, exactly. My parents' generation didn't focus too much on the emotional state of children. It wasn't really a concern. Right. I don't think that really came until the generation after mine, where we actually started paying attention to how kids feel, how they receive information and what they're doing.
Right.
So it was overlooked for a long time.
Okay. Then you go through, you turn 5, you turn, pre-adolescence and how did things really, how did things, as far as the bipolar, how did it develop? I mean, do you tell me, how did you had to have some problems, you had to face some issues, I'm certain, but what were the problems, what were the issues you started to confront you as you grew older?
In middle school, I struggled a lot. And in high school, I struggled even more. I got into a lot of fights and it was just because of my anger and my rage. And looking back, I feel bad because a lot of people didn't deserve what was done. I also had huge fluctuations in my grades. When I would be more hypomanic, I would excel and exceed, and the grades looked good, and everything was done. And then when I would crash and fall into that deep depression, all my homework was late, my grades were dropping,
Right.
and so it was just a constant. She can do good, she's not doing good. She's doing good, and she's not doing so good. So my parents couldn't understand why my report cards looked the way that they looked because I would get A's and B's and then I would get D's and F's. So that was all of high school and all of middle school.
Okay, so knowing a little bit about bipolar disorder, you have these extreme highs and extreme lows. How
Yeah.
and was there a pattern? Like how long were your highs, and then how quickly did it take to drop to the lows? That's what I'm curious. Like, were you on a high for weeks and months, or was it days? What was the duration of these periods of extremes?
When I was a child, I feel like they lasted way longer,
Okay,
that it could be weeks. But
okay,
as I became an adult and it would last at a max of like 3 days.
okay,
And then I would crash and I wouldn't have um another period of hypomania for about 8 to 9 months. And that made it actually very difficult for me to understand when I was becoming hypomanic
right.
because I experienced it way less than the depression. So it would always take me like a day and a half to realize, no, you're not in a good mood. No, you're not just
Right,
motivated today.
right,
Like, this
right.
is the other half of the situation.
So you would go into, just to see if I'm clear, you would go into these hypomanic states for a couple of days and then crash for months, go into depression.
Yeah.
So you were
Yeah.
you were I know people who suffer bipolar. Some stay hypomanic for extreme periods of time, and then go into depression for a couple and go back out quickly. So
Right.
you would fluctuate from the highs and then, but just for months and months in the depression.
Yeah. So that's the difference between bipolar type 1 disorder and bipolar type 2 disorder.
Okay.
Bipolar type 1, they stay manic
Okay.
for much longer and they suffer less periods of depression. And bipolar type 2, which is what I was dealing with at the time, was a lot more depression and less hypomania.
Okay. And during middle school and high school, were you treated? I mean, did your parents? I mean, I know they were that. Did they even think maybe she has some chemical imbalance or something? Or was it just
No, not
Christine being Christine?
yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what they thought. They just thought that that was me and I moved out at 18 um and I started, my sister's a little older than I am, so my sister would get me drinks and drinking and adding to that state of emotion was never really a good thing. It kind of came out to be a lot more of an issue than a solution.
Right, right,
And by the time I was 21, I was already working in a very professional atmosphere and I was excelling and exceeding. But I was also, going out a lot on the weekends when I didn't have my son. And the amount of alcohol that I would consume, because it was really the only time, it would be the first couple of hours of drinking where you feel normal, you feel like yourself.
and the euphoria kicks in because at first it's a stimulant, but then
Exactly.
it's actual depressant.
Exactly. And then after that first like 2 hour period, you become very much so just unpredictable, even unpredictable to myself.
Right.
Because the next day I would look back and I would think to myself, I'm like, I did not see some of those responses and actions coming.
Right.
So, yeah.
It's I relate this to you. I'm talking about this. I've had issues with some depression. I was diagnosed as bipolar, but then I've been through my own challenges, Christine. So
Yeah.
I know, and when I was reading the book about how you go out and party, you were living like a dual life. You had a
Yes.
great mother, you had a great son, you were great, you were working, you were responsible, and you held it all together. Then you'd go out and just let go, and
Yeah.
and
I thought I had it all under control. I thought
right,
that that was how it was supposed to be. I had my son when I was 20 years old and I was already working in the medical field at that point for about a year and a half.
okay,
So I just thought, you know, when my son goes with his father on the weekend, that is my time to be my age. That's my time to be 21. And I thought that that was what being 21 meant. And it was the only time I didn't have responsibility in my mind, and I would like let go, but it didn't pan out well.
No, it typically doesn't.
No,
Self-medication never really pans out well.
no,
But
no,
here's
no, no.
an interesting statistic from the National Alliance of Mental Illnesses. Over over a half of all people who suffer from some type of mental disorder go untreated.
Yeah.
And it's unbelievable because whether it's they don't want to acknowledge the fact that they might have something wrong with them, people don't see it in them, but they think it's Christine being Christine and Scott being
Mhm.
Scott, and they're just crazy, whatever. They're a wild child.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's sad. It's sad. It's something we'll talk about that down the road. But yeah, the untreated mental disorders. I like to call them illnesses because it gives a stigma. They're just a disorder. They're a chemical imbalance.
Right.
Everybody has different chemical makeup, and we'll talk about this. So, okay, so you go in your 20s, and you said you were diagnosed at 27, I believe.
Yeah,
How,
27.
how did you go to the 20s to 27 being diagnosed? How did that pan out?
Well, so okay, so I clearly knew in my heart something was really off, right? I really did know that. But I thought I was hiding it, I guess, better than I was.
Okay.
And one day my sister was watching TV and she saw a commercial for bipolar disorder and the medication. And she called me and she was like, Chris, I think I know what's wrong with you. And I'm like, immediately defensive. So I'm like, what do you mean? And she says, I was watching this commercial and I actually think you have bipolar disorder. So I did what Christine would do. I yelled at her and I hung up. And then I proceeded to do what Christine would do. I waited about 15 minutes and I called her back and I'm like, I'm going to prove to you that I am not.
Right.
And so I'm going to call and make an appointment with a psychiatrist and I'm going to prove to you that I'm not. And
Right.
so I waited, like 30 days for my appointment, finally got in, saw the doctor, walked out with a prescription and a diagnosis of bipolar type 2. So she was right. I had to call her and tell her. I'm like, part of me actually felt relieved at that point because I felt like there were some answers to why I was part of the way that I was,
Yeah.
and I wanted to I just could never understand it. I thought maybe it was my diet, maybe it was lack of exercise, maybe it was the alcohol consumption, maybe it was, but when the doctor broke it down, he I couldn't even deny it to myself that I knew he was right.
Right. I love when people would tell you, just control yourself.
Yeah.
You have this thing where I don't have discipline. I don't have self-control. In every other aspect of your life, you have discipline and self-control, but
Yes.
this you didn't. But and it's frustrating because people look at you and think you're an abject failure when you're not,
Yes.
and
Yep. I agree.
and it's sad, and that's what happens. But it's good that you had your sister actually call you out on it,
Yeah,
because
she's been my strong point my whole
right,
life,
right.
always good, bad, and indifferent.
And that's why I
And
remember you said that in here. Yeah.
yeah, she's my best friend. But I do want to touch on something you mentioned earlier as well. It's very true, and I don't think that people think about this too often. If you're having chest pain, you go to a cardiologist.
Right.
If you're having kidney stones, I'm sorry, you go to a nephrologist.
Right.
When there's something going on in your mind, it is okay to go to a psychiatrist.
It's
Your brain is just another organ, and that organ can malfunction.
right.
So there's no shame behind that, you
You know,
know?
I preach that. That's why in our podcast of vulnerability, it's a sign of, our podcast, A Lion Among Sheep. It's a show of strength to go and
Yeah,
say and be vulnerable and say, I have issues. I
right.
know we all need someone to talk to. And in our day and age, when men have to be men and hard and strong, and even people, women who are professionals, women have that persona of strong. We're afraid to open up and talk to people about it.
Yeah.
It's so important to do that. And you're right. It's a chemical imbalance. People may have, ulcers or something because of their body chemistry, the brain, and it talked about it's the highest metabolic consumption in all the organs, the brain.
Hmm.
And it's all
Yeah.
based on chemical reaction, neurons. And if those chemicals are not in check, in a homeostasis environment, something goes wrong. And the funny thing is, under Johns Hopkins has recently did a study, and they believe 26% of all Americans suffer from some type of diagnosable mental disorder. 1 out of 5,
Yeah.
1 out of 4. And whether it's anxiety disorders or bipolar or schizoaffective, 1 out of 4. You know, room with 4 people,
Yep.
one of the person's going to have something. But it's more prevalent than we know, just like high blood pressure, obesity, and things along that nature. It's up there. It's up there.
Yeah, it definitely is. It definitely is. And one thing that I do, so a few years ago, actually, the statistic for that was 1 out of 5. So now to know that it's 1 out of 4, we can see that, this is something that's continuing to impact society.
Right.
But I do also, I think about the fact that I took over 10 years of medication, well over 10 years.
Okay.
It may have been 15.
Why, I was going to say at 27, you were diagnosed. That was like 2 years ago. Christine looks a lot younger than she is. Okay. She looks like she's, but why don't you tell our viewers, how old are you now?
I'm 44 now.
So you're 44. So
yeah.
That was, now let me see the math. What was it? 17? How many years ago was that? 17 years ago, you were diagnosed, right?
Yeah. 17.
Roughly 16, 17.
Yeah, more than 17, but yeah.
But then, okay, so for 17 years, now let's go over, if we could briefly go over, because we're going to talk about this. We're going to have her back on in the next week or there's so many, we talked about this. We could go about 4 or 5 hours on this subject because it's such a great subject. So for 17 years, there was issues with your medication. And I'm going to talk about the spiritual component of your battle. Get to that.
Yes, absolutely.
What was the journey to the medications?
So you know what? I'm going to be completely honest. When I first started taking the psychiatric medication, I would also drink on the weekend.
Right.
So obviously my medication couldn't work very well, right? Because you're kind of negating the possibility of your medication making an impact, right? So eventually I drew back from drinking and I said, okay, I just want to get better. And I have tried almost every medication there is except for lithium. Okay. With obviously my psychiatrist overseeing that. Right. And what it is I do understand that, some people need a specific cocktail of medication. Something can't be too high, the other one can't be too low, whatever it is. And I took medication. I lived a healthy lifestyle, meaning I ate clean. I went to the gym. I reduced my stress. I slept 8 to 8.5 hours every night. I did everything. I avoided drugs and alcohol, and I did all the things that I was told and instructed to do. And what would happen is the medication would work. It would always just take the edge off, but it never really helped. And I try to tell people, if you're not getting at least 80% of a benefit from your medication, you need to go back and consult with your psychiatrist. Okay? Because you don't have to deal with the minimum of feeling better. But for me, it would just take the edge off, and it would only last. It would last at first for like 2 weeks. Okay. And toward the end, before I was healed, it was lasting only like 4 days. And then I'd be back into the pit of like just torture and doom. And the last thing that they had actually prescribed me was Depakote. And for me, that was like something that was very difficult for me to swallow, I guess, because I had always told myself, I'm okay. It's just something that's a little off and I'm okay. But by the time you get to Depakote, you have to realize that you're severe. Right. This isn't a little issue. This is a little bit bigger of a little issue. So
the funny thing is, the medication for mental disorders, our chemistries are so different in each brain. So, but I go, you have a muscle spasm, you get Flexeril or Terradol, but there are a few that, and they work. Just, right. But Neurontin may work for, me. It may never work for you. There's all these different, Depakote may work for you. It may not work for me. It's just the brain chemistry is so different in each person. So that's why it's such a difficult thing to treat. It's not like high blood pressure or a broken arm. You cast it and well, you're done. You wait, 6 weeks or whatever, and it's healed. So it's very, very difficult. Okay. So you've always had a strong faith, have you not?
I have.
Tell me about your faith journey, because that's important in your overcoming this disorder. I know, very important.
So when I was little, uh, and I lived in New York, I moved out of New York when I was 5. So my mom always had us in church, and it was a Pentecostal church because it was really the only church in our little neighborhood.
Yeah.
When we moved here to Florida,
What part of New York?
Peekskill, where Bear Mountain is.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. Fair enough.
So when we
Right on the Hudson River.
the Hudson, we had a stream of the Hudson River that would run through our backyard. It was
Right,
beautiful.
right.
Uh, so when we moved to Florida, we really couldn't find a church. We tried out a few of them, didn't really go anywhere. A little later in life, my sister started going to church, and she would just. I, I always knew God was a part of my life. He was someone that I thought about when I did things, just kind of daily, you know?
Right.
And when I did bad things, I thought of him a lot as well. And I was ignorant to, what the word says at that time, but I would just kind of hope that he didn't see that. But now, we all know God sees all. So, so my sister started going back to church, and she would call me and she'd be like, "Oh, are you going to church on Sunday? Are you going to church?" So I actually just went to make her stop asking me. And the first 3 Sundays that I went to church, I was actually hungover. I had just gotten back from being out partying on Saturday night, and God started convicting me very quickly. And I just started to feel how wrong that was. So I thought that I could continue to do both, serve God and, live how I wanted to. So I would go out Friday night instead of Saturday night. So I would be completely sober on Sunday.
Yeah.
Um, but it just kind of took root from there. I just started feeling his presence more. I started wanting to do things not because I was afraid that God would punish me, but because I didn't want to hurt his feelings.
Okay.
And so from there, that was just kind of like where it all started to come about. Thank God I found him, because I know for many years of my life he had been calling me and I was ignoring him you know?
Right.
So the foundation was set by my mom, but my sister's the one that really watered that seed for me.
And then by going and just going and going and going, you finally, his presence took hold in you, I should say, for lack of a better description, and really sort of I would say guide you,
Yeah.
guiding you through your path. And you gave,
Yeah,
I'm assuming you gave up that Friday night party
I
and,
did.
and you
Yes, I
worship
did.
God instead of the party scene and God. So you picked a God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I gave up because I started to really honestly realize how empty that lifestyle is.
Yeah.
You know, TV makes it look a lot more fun than living it is,
Oh
and
yeah.
it just, you wake up, you don't feel good, you've spent money you didn't really want to spend, and you've gotten nowhere and you've gotten nothing. And I realized that when I would go to church, or I would spend time in the presence of God through worship or through prayer or through journaling or just reading the word,
Right.
that was so much more filling for me.
Absolutely.
That was answering the questions that like were quiet and inside of me, that the world could just not ever answer for me.
Right.
So I just kept trying to press in and search for him more and more.
So I want to go into real quickly, because we're going to continue this
Yeah.
conversation next week, not 2 weeks from now. Next week we're going to have to continue this conversation. So what happened? What medication are you on now?
I'm on no medication. I've
No
been on no
medication.
medication.
I want to know, since 2021 something happened. I think that's what you said. God stepped in.
Yes, he did. Yes, he
So,
did.
so tell me and our viewers that amazing transformation.
Okay. This will forever probably be my favorite story. So, I had a call with my psychiatrist, and it was, over the camera like this,
Right.
because of COVID, and he had prescribed me Depakote.
Okay.
So, right after my interview, I'm sorry, my appointment with my doctor, my boyfriend came over and he asked me, he said, "How did your visit go?" And I just kind of shook my head and I didn't say anything. And he's like, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, they're giving me Depakote now. And I had always told myself that this isn't so bad as long as I never get prescribed Depakote." And I had tears in my eyes. And he said, "Why are you so upset?" And I said, "Because I know the side effects of Depakote, and I know that they're quite severe." So I started crying. And he said, "You just have to have hope." And I told him, I said, I just, it's been so long and I don't have any more hope anymore.
Right.
And so I stayed taking the medication, as prescribed. It was doing very little to help me. In approximately 4 or 5 days after I started, it went back to nothing. I
Right.
had no benefit from the medication. We have a prophet that we know from our church. His name is KK Chin. He was doing a service one night, so we all went. And, I wasn't feeling great, but I went. My son, my boyfriend, and my boyfriend's mother were all present during this, and he just asked me to stand. And he said, "Do you need healing?" And I said, "I do." And in front of a church full of people, I had to admit that I needed healing for bipolar disorder. And that was something I actually hid from everybody pretty much my whole life. Only the very close people around me knew. And he prayed for me, and I opened my heart completely because I had always known God was going to heal me. I just didn't know when. And I knew that I was running to the end of my rope at this point, and I received the prayer. um and I went home that night. He actually asked me, "Do you trust God enough to stop your medication?" And I said, "I do." Okay. So the prayer's over and we all go home. And I feel completely the same. Like nothing has changed.
Right.
And I my alarm goes off on my phone. It's time to take the medication. I go to the kitchen, I reach up into the cabinet, and right as I go to reach for it, I remember that I said I trusted God enough to not take my medication. So I paced back and forth in the kitchen for 45 minutes before I went to bed. Um, I went to bed and I had multiple encounters with Jesus that night. His presence was it was beyond felt. I really truly feel as though he was sitting on the foot of my bed waiting for me to wake up and ask him my questions, because I know stopping psychiatric medication abruptly can cause seizures, heart failure, and all of these things. But in my mind, I couldn't believe that God would tell me to do it and then let me die either. So I kind of started to wake up into a subconscious state. And I said to God, I said, "What if this doesn't work?" And he said, "I told you I've got you." And I fell back into a deeper sleep. I woke up, I came to a subconscious state for the second time, and I said, "God, just don't let my heart stop." And he said, "My word is never void." Up until that day, I did not even know that those were words in the Bible.
Is that something?
So yeah, so this encounter happened 6 more times that night, but I don't recall what the conversation was. The next morning when I woke up, everything in my mind was silent.
Right.
There was no more mental noise. The anguish, the deep pitted depression, it was gone.
Now
And
let me tell you this. Some people would probably say, "Yeah, you're crazy. You saw
absolutely.
God. You saw God appeared, but Jesus." And but the fact of the matter is that happened in 2021, correct?
Yes,
And we're 2025. You haven't taken medication,
nothing.
and your life's amazing right now, is it not?
Yes, it is. Amen. And I've been cleared by the psychiatrist. I allowed to follow him for another year. And so he himself could see I was healed without medication, and
Right.
my family can attest to all of it. So,
You know what? This is something that we're gonna go down this road in our next week. I want to continue this conversation, Christine. This is and people don't understand the power of prayer and the power of Jesus, the power of God. And I
yeah.
I I, I have seen it, transform me into someone who was incarcerated in jail for drinking into
Hmm.
someone who's living a very good life now. And it took me years and years and years to get to where you are. And that's what it does. It's a process.
It
But
is.
it's something. There's a lot more to your story I want to go into, and what we can't do. We're running out of time today. But Christine, I appreciate you coming on. What would you give advice to anybody, if you could, who's suffering from the same issues you suffered from, who are saying, "Oh, it's just you know Shelly being Shelly. It's Bob being Bob." I mean, what are the biggest steps? What were the biggest steps you had to take? To
Um, as
start?
the person, as the person suffering from the condition itself, I have to say, first of all, you can never give up. When
Okay,
you're tired, you need to learn how to rest, but not give up.
right.
I would say you need to pray and surrender to God every single day,
Yeah,
because just because today looks the way that it does, it doesn't mean that tomorrow is going to be the same way.
Right.
So just put your hope, put your faith in God, and he will move mountains for you. Miraculous things will happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Christine, you are a lion among the sheep. And that's why you say that in your book somewhere. You mentioned about being a lion somewhere. It's a very,
Yes.
and that, when I read that, I'm like, we got to get her. Just not only because of that, but because of your whole story, how you came, you confronted an obstacle, a challenge, and you overcame it. That is what lions do. They don't just buckle and just say, I'm crazy. I'm going to be this the rest of my
Right.
life. So change, and change is a big part of being who we are. So guys, I'm going to post her Instagram on the bottom of these comments. Reach out to me. We're gonna have Christine on again. I appreciate it, Christine. Continue what you're doing. Continue spreading the word, not only of overcoming bipolar, but the power of prayer, the power of Jesus, and the power of God Himself. And so, God bless you, young lady. I appreciate it, and thanks for coming on. We'll be back. We'll see each other next week, I guarantee. So,
thank you, Scott.
Guys, have a great couple of days, and we'll see you in a few days. Take care. Bye bye.
0, 1. Let's get started. Why they stopping me?